The fog was so thick it swallowed everything: the road, the trees, even the sound of my own car. My headlights barely cut through the dense gray, and every turn felt like I was driving deeper into nowhere. Just as I thought I might have to stop and wait it out, I saw it, a figure, tall and unmoving, standing in the middle of the road. At first I thought it was a person, maybe someone lost or in trouble, but as I slowed down I realized something was wrong. Its posture, its stillness, and the way the fog seemed to cling to it like a second skin. That was when I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. I've always had a bad sense of direction. If there's a chance to get lost, I'll find it, even with GPS to guide me. That night, though, I truly outdid myself. I was driving back home from a weekend trip with friends, exhausted from too many late nights and long conversations. I was eager to get home and fall into my own bed, but the highway traffic was brutal. Red taillights stretched as far as the eye could see, and I couldn't stomach the idea of crawling along for hours. That's when I made the decision I'd regret. My GPS, which had been glitching all evening, recalculated again and displayed an alternate route, a backroad shortcut that cut through the mountains. 15 minutes faster, it claimed. It seemed like a gift from the travel gods, so without a second thought, I took the next exit. At first, the detour felt like the right call. The road was narrow and winding, but there was a peacefulness to it. The moonlight spilled through the gaps in the trees, casting silvery patterns across the asphalt. The air seemed fresher, and for the first time that evening, I felt like I could breathe. The engine's soft hum was the only sound, a comforting rhythm that kept me company. I even found myself relaxing. I rolled down the window to let in the crisp night air, hoping it would keep me awake. The road curved sharply, each turn revealing more of the dense forest. I didn't see another car, not even a distant set of headlights. Normally, that would have unsettled me, but out here it felt liberating, like I'd found a secret no one else knew about. Then the fog rolled in. It wasn't gradual, like you'd expect. 1 second the road ahead was clear, and the next, a wall of white swallowed everything. I blinked, thinking maybe my headlights were reflecting off something, but no. It was fog, dense and impenetrable. My headlights barely made a dent in it, their beams scattering like they were fighting against the mist. I slowed to a crawl, my knuckles tightening on the wheel. The trees on either side of the road disappeared into the haze, leaving me driving through what felt like a ghostly void. The edges of the road blurred, and I had to squint to make sure I didn't veer off into the ditch. The silence outside became suffocating, heavier than it had been just moments before. Even the hum of the car felt muted, like the fog was swallowing the sound. I reached for my phone to check the Jeeps again, but the screen was frozen. No signal. That's when I felt it. It hit me suddenly, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, sharp and insistent. You know, that feeling when you're alone in a room but can't shake the sense that someone's watching you. That's exactly what it felt like, only amplified. My skin crawled and my hands started to sweat against the steering wheel. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, sitting in the back seat. Nothing. The seats were empty, but the feeling didn't go away. Get a grip, I muttered to myself, my voice shaky. It had to be the fog playing tricks on me. I'd been driving for hours, and I was exhausted. My nerves were just frayed from the stress of the weekend, the long drive, and the isolation of the road. But even as I tried to rationalize it, the unease lingered. It wasn't just the fog or the dark. It was something deeper, something I couldn't put into words. The air inside the car felt colder, and a tightness began to grow in my chest, curling like a cold fist. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to go back to the highway and the safety of familiar lights and sounds. But turning back meant admitting I'd made a mistake, and I was too stubborn to do that. Besides, how bad could a little foggy shortcut really be? I told myself to keep going, ignoring the knot of dread in my stomach. The road stretched on, endlessly winding through the haze, and the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I was so focused on the road ahead that when I first saw the figure, I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. It was nothing more than a shadow in the dense fog at first, just a dark smudge, standing dead center in the middle of the road. As I inched closer, my heart began to race. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. The figure stood completely still, motionless except for the faint swirling of fog around its legs. It wasn't waving for help or walking to the side of the road. It just stood there. At first I thought it might be a stranded hiker, maybe someone who had gotten lost in the thick mist, but the longer I looked, the more I realized something about it wasn't right. My car crawled forward, my headlights casting an eerie glow over the figure. Its shape became clearer, but instead of comfort, the details made my stomach churn. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed just a little too long. Its posture was rigid, almost robotic, and the way it held its head tilted slightly to one side made my skin crawl. It didn't react to the sound of my car, or the beam of my headlights, as though it hadn't noticed me at all, or worse, as though it didn't care. I slowed the car to a stop, my hands gripping the wheel tightly as I tried to decide what to do.
"Hey!" I called out, my voice shaky as I cracked the window just enough for sound to escape.
The air outside was icy and the fog carried it into the car, chilling me to the bone. The figure didn't respond. It didn't even flinch. "Do you need help?" I asked, louder this time. My breath fogged up the window and I wiped at it, nervously trying to keep my eyes on the figure, but it didn't move. It didn't acknowledge me in. Anyway, I began to notice more. The fog wasn't just around the figure. It was clinging to it, swirling. Unnaturally close, as though it were a part of the mist itself. Its limbs, thin and angular, seemed to stretch longer the more I stared, and its head remained tilted at that unnatural angle, facing away from me. A chill ran down my spine and I felt the first sharp pang of genuine fear. "What are you doing?" "Out here," I called, though the words sounded hollow in the oppressive silence. Still didn't answer. That was enough for me. My rational mind had long since been replaced by the primal urge to get away. Whatever this was, it wasn't normal. I didn't want to stick around to figure it out. I slammed the car into gear and pressed the gas pedal, the tires skidding slightly on the damp road as I swerved to avoid the figure. My breath caught as I passed it, my peripheral vision catching glimpses I wished I could unsee. Its unnatural height, the way its arms hung too low, its motionless posture that somehow radiated menace. As I sped away, I couldn't resist the urge to look back. My rear-view mirror reflected the road behind me, and for a moment I thought I was safe. The figure was still there, standing exactly where I had left it. Then, its head moved. It didn't turn slowly, the way a person would. It snapped toward me, its face, or lack of one, now tilted in my direction. Though I couldn't make out its features, I felt the weight of its gaze, cold and heavy, pressing against my chest like a physical force. I tore my eyes away and gripped the wheel tighter, forcing myself to focus on the road ahead. But the image of that figure stayed burned into my mind, and with every curve of the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't left it behind. I drove faster than I should have, adrenaline pumping through my veins and my mind racing. With every possibility of what I had just seen, my breath came in shallow gasps, fogging up the windshield as I struggled to steady myself. I told myself over and over to focus on the road, not to look back. The figure was behind me now, and I was putting distance between us. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. The fog didn't let up. If anything, it grew denser, swallowing up the faint outlines of the trees and rocks that lined the road. My headlights barely cut through it, their beams scattering uselessly in the thick mist. I could only see a few feet ahead, and even then the lines of the road seemed to bend and twist unnaturally, like the asphalt itself was shifting beneath my tires. I tightened my grip on the wheel, my fingers aching as they dug into the leather. I felt a small pang of relief when I realized I was still driving forward, moving away from whatever I had encountered. The road stretched endlessly ahead, winding through the fog like a ribbon, unraveling into the void. After a few minutes, my pounding heart began to slow. "It's fine," I whispered to myself, though my voice sounded hollow. "You're fine. You're getting out of here." But just as I started to feel the smallest hint of relief, I saw it again. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. The fog shifted strangely in the distance, forming shapes that seemed to ripple and then dissolve into nothing. I blinked, leaning forward, as if that would help my eyes focus through the haze. And then I saw it clearly, the figure, standing dead center in the road, exactly as it had before. My stomach dropped. It couldn't be. I hadn't turned around. I was sure of it. I'd been driving straight this entire time. But there it was, tall and motionless, its silhouette distorted by the swirling fog. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the damp road before jerking to a halt.
My
Chest heaved as I stared at the figure through the windshield, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. How was this possible? How could it be here, ahead of me? Had I somehow looped back to the same spot? Or worse, was it following me? The figure tilted its head slightly, just like before. The motion was slow, deliberate, and it sent a
chill down my spine. It wasn't just watching me. It knew I was watching it.
I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. All I knew was that I had to get away. I slammed the car into drive, my foot pressing the gas pedal to the floor. The tires squealed against the wet road as the car lurched forward. I swerved sharply to avoid the figure, the side mirror barely brushing past its outstretched arm. This time, I didn't look back. But even as I sped away, the terror clung to me like a second skin. The road stretched on, endless and empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that somehow the figure was still there, still watching. The further I drove, the more the road seemed to change. The curves grew sharper, the fog thicker, and the landscape on either side became increasingly unfamiliar. The trees I had once seen were gone, replaced by jagged rocks and barren stretches of dirt. It felt like the world was shrinking around me, closing in, trapping me in its suffocating embrace. I drove faster, desperate to escape, but no matter how far I went, the fear only grew stronger. And then, in the distance, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was the figure. Again. I kept driving, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. The fog grew thicker with every passing mile, and the road felt like it was leading me deeper into nowhere. The air inside the car was heavy and stifling, pressing against my chest as though the fog had followed me in. The trees disappeared first. At some point, I realized there were no more shadows flanking the road, no looming shapes of branches clawing at the mist. The road itself began to narrow, the edges blurring into an endless expanse of pale gray. It was like I was driving through nothingness, a void that stretched on forever. And then I saw it, a faint glow in the distance. Relief flooded through me. Maybe it was a house or a gas station, some sign of civilization, where I could stop and catch my breath. I pressed the gas pedal a little harder, the car surging forward as I raced toward the light, but as I got closer, something felt wrong. The glow wasn't warm or inviting. It wasn't the flicker of a porch light or the hum of fluorescent bulbs. It was cold, unnatural, and it seemed to pulse faintly, like it was alive. The road ended abruptly, spilling out into a wide-open valley. My headlights illuminated the barren expanse ahead, a flat, rocky wasteland blanketed in swirling fog. The glow emanated from the mist itself, casting an eerie, otherworldly light over the valley. I slowed the car to a stop, my heart pounding as I took in the scene. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the faint hum of the engine. The air was heavier here, pressing against my chest like physical weight. For a moment, I considered turning back, but the thought of encountering the figure again made my stomach churn. Then I saw it. At first, it was just one, the same tall, motionless figure standing at the edge of the valley. But as I stared, more shapes began to emerge from the fog. They were everywhere. Tall, angular forms glided through the mist, their movements slow and deliberate, their heads tilted in unison, their hollow eyes fixed on me. They didn't walk so much as float, their limbs swaying unnaturally with every step. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The valley wasn't empty. It was their home. And I had just entered it. The fog closed in around me, thick and impenetrable, swallowing the world beyond my windshield. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles white and trembling. The figures were everywhere now, their long, contorted forms weaving in and out of the mist. No matter how hard I pressed the gas pedal, no matter how many turns I took, I couldn't escape them. They moved slowly, deliberately, their heads tilting in unnatural angles as though mocking my desperate attempts to flee. Their limbs stretched impossibly long, swaying like tree branches in a storm, yet their movements were unnervingly silent. The only sound was the hum of my engine, which felt weaker with every passing moment, as if the fog itself was suffocating it. Then it happened. The car jerked to a sudden halt, the engine sputtering once before dying completely. My heart sank into my stomach as the headlights flickered, casting eerie, sporadic flashes over the road. Ahead, the last burst of light illuminated them, dozens of figures standing motionless just a few feet from the car, their hollow eyes fixed on me. "No, no, no," I whispered, fumbling with the keys. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even grip them properly. The ignition clicked uselessly, over and over, but the engine refused to start. They didn't run. They didn't rush. They simply glided closer, their forms dissolving and reappearing in the fog as though the mist itself was part of them. I could feel their presence now, pressing against the car like an invisible weight. The air inside was stifling, thick with the smell of damp earth and something metallic, like rust or blood. I locked the doors instinctively, though deep down, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. A loud thud echoed from the roof, making me jump so violently I hit my head against the window. Another thud followed, then a slow, deliberate scraping sound like nails dragging across metal. My breath hitched as I looked up, unable to see anything through the ceiling. The whispers began next. Soft at first, like the distant rustle of leaves, but they grew louder, sharper, their words indistinct, but full of malice. The voices overlapped, rising and falling in a chaotic rhythm that made my head throb. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. One of the figures was crouched by the driver's side window, its face mere inches from the glass. It was wrong. Grotesquely pale, its skin stretched too tightly over a skull-like face. Its eyes were empty voids, and its mouth was impossibly wide, filled with jagged, yellowed teeth that gleamed faintly in the dim light. I froze, every muscle in my body locked in terror. It tilted its head, the motion sharp and jerky, and pressed a hand against the window. Its fingers were long and skeletal, the nails blackened and cracked. "You don't belong here," it whispered, its voice low and rasping, like wind scraping through a hollow tree. The door handle jiggled. My paralysis broke, and I scrambled to the passenger side, throwing myself out of the car. The moment my feet hit the ground, the whispers erupted into a deafening roar. The fog thickened. Instantly, wrapping around me like a living thing. I couldn't see the car anymore. I couldn't see anything. I ran. I didn't know where I was going or if I was even moving forward. The ground beneath me felt uneven, shifting with every step. My lungs burned. My legs ached, but I didn't stop. The whispers followed, louder and more chaotic, blending with the sound of heavy footsteps that seemed to echo from all directions. Suddenly I tripped. My body hit the ground hard, knocking the wind out of me. As I scrambled to my feet, I realized the whispers had stopped. The silence was worse. Slowly, I turned my head, and there they were, all of them. Around me, their hollow eyes staring, their heads tilting in unison. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. One of them stepped forward, its impossibly long arm reaching out toward me. Its fingers brushed my shoulder, cold and wet like the fog itself. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was sitting in my car, parked on the side of a quiet highway. The sun was rising, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. The fog was gone, the air crisp and clear. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But then I saw the scratches. Deep, jagged marks ran the length of the car, etched into the metal like claw marks. View mirror was cracked and the driver's side window was smeared with something dark and oily. I drove home in silence, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what had happened, but no. Matter how much I tried to rationalize it, one thing was clear. I hadn't escaped, not really. Even now I hear them sometimes, soft whispers in the dead of night, the faint sound of footsteps in the fog. I know they're still out there waiting. If you ever find yourself on an unfamiliar road and the fog starts to close in, turn around. Don't. Stop. Don't back. And if you see a figure watching you, remember, you don't belong there. If you dare, share this story, but be warned, every time it's retold, the fog spreads. Are you sure you're alone as you finish reading this? I never planned on taking that road. Actually, I'm not even sure how I ended up there. I was just trying to get home after a long day at work, tired and hungry, the kind of tired where you feel it in your bones. My phone's G-Ups had stopped working hours ago because of spotty service in the area, and I was pretty sure I'd missed my turn somewhere back near the gas station with the peeling red sign. But I kept driving, convinced that if I just went a little farther, I'd find a road that looked familiar. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the world bathed in darkness. My car headlights cut through the night, but they only revealed a seemingly endless stretch of road ahead. The asphalt was cracked and uneven, bordered by tall, spindly trees that looked more like twisted skeletons in the dim light. There were no streetlights, no signs, no other cars. Just me and the faint hum of my old sedan. I should have turned around. I know that now, but at the time I told myself I was fine. I didn't want to waste more time retracing my steps.
After all, what's the worst that could happen?
It began with the fog, though calling it fog feels like an understatement. This wasn't the kind you wake up to in the early hours of morning, soft and dreamlike as it lifts with the rising sun. No, this fog was something else entirely. It was thicker, heavier, unnatural. 1 second, the road ahead was clear, and the next, everything vanished behind a dense, suffocating curtain of white. It didn't drift in slowly like you'd expect. It was there all at once, like it had been waiting for me to arrive. At first, I thought it was just a strange weather phenomenon, something to brush off with a casual shrug. But as my car inched forward, the realization sank in. My headlights couldn't pierce through it. Their beams, usually so reliable, seemed to dissolve in the fog, scattering into useless fragments of light. The world outside was gone, swallowed whole by this impenetrable haze. I slowed to a crawl, barely moving, my foot hovering over the brake. My knuckles were white. Against the steering wheel, every muscle in my body tense. The road, if it was even still a road, had turned into a vague suggestion of asphalt beneath my tires. Instinctively, as if being a few inches closer to the windshield would somehow help me see better, it didn't. The silence was the worst part. It wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, like the fog was pressing down on everything, muffling even the faintest of sounds. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no hum of distant engines, just the low rumble of my own car, struggling against the oppressive stillness. Then came the prickling sensation. It started at the base of my neck, a sharp, electric awareness that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't a physical touch, but it felt close, intimate even, like a pair of unseen eyes boring into the back of my head. I flicked a quick glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, sitting in the back seat. My stomach clenched as my eyes scanned the empty space, just the dark, familiar shape of my car's interior, nothing out of place. But the feeling didn't go away. I adjusted the mirror nervously, my fingers trembling. "It's fine," I whispered to myself, though my voice sounded small and unsure. "It's just the fog, that's all. You're tired and it's messing with your head. But no amount of rationalizing could shake that persistent, gnawing unease. I tried turning on the radio, hoping the sound of music or even a static-filled talk show would distract me. But all I got was silence, dead air. The display screen glitched for a moment, flickering before it blinked off entirely. "Great," I muttered, slapping the console in frustration. The sudden noise felt jarring against the stillness, echoing louder than it should have. I regretted it immediately, as if I'd disturbed something that wanted to be left alone. The road stretched endlessly ahead, or at least that's what I assumed. I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, and my phone had lost signal miles ago. For the first time, the isolation of the empty road didn't feel peaceful. It felt hostile, like the fog itself was alive and watching. I pressed my lips together and tightened my grip on the wheel, trying to focus. If I just kept driving, I'd find my way out of this. The fog couldn't go on forever, right? It had to end somewhere. But the feeling persisted, the prickling awareness that someone or something was there with me. It wasn't just paranoia. It felt real, tangible, as though I could turn my head and catch a glimpse of it if I dared to look. "Get a grip," I muttered under my breath, the words falling flat in the heavy air. "You're just tired. You'll laugh about this tomorrow." But my voice sounded hollow, unconvincing even to myself. Then, for the briefest moment, I thought I saw movement in the fog, just a flicker, something dark and shifting at the edge of my vision. I snapped my head toward the window, my heart pounding. There was nothing there, just the swirling mist, twisting lazily like it was teasing me. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger, more insistent. My breath hitched and I fought the urge to pull over. Stopping in this fog felt like inviting whatever was out there to get closer, to close the distance between us. So I kept driving, forcing my eyes to stay locked on the hazy suggestion of the road ahead. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching into an eternity. I couldn't tell if I was making any progress or if the fog had trapped me in some endless loop. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I could feel my exhaustion giving way to raw, gnawing fear. I didn't know it then, but the fog wasn't just an inconvenience. It was the beginning of something much worse, something I wouldn't escape. The road had become a lifeline, a fragile thread pulling me forward through the suffocating fog. I was so focused on staying on that faint path that I almost didn't see it. The figure appeared, suddenly like a shadow rising from the mist, standing still in the middle of the road. My stomach dropped, and my heart shot into my throat as I slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched against the uneven asphalt, the car skidding slightly before coming to a shuddering halt. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my breathing, quick and shallow, and the faint ticking of the cooling engine. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly they ached, but I couldn't bring myself to let go. My headlights illuminated the figure, casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the fog. It didn't move. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe a stranded hiker or someone lost out here just like me. But the longer I stared, the more I realized something was terribly wrong. The figure was tall, too tall, its elongated limbs unnervingly thin, almost fragile. Its posture was stiff and unnatural, like a marionette waiting for its strings to be pulled. The fog seemed to cling to it, swirling and twisting unnaturally around its form, as if it were a part of the mist itself. I leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, trying to make out its features. There weren't any. Where a face should have been, there was only a void, a dark, shapeless emptiness that made my skin crawl. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaky as I rolled the window down just enough to be heard. The cold, damp air rushed in, carrying the faint metallic scent of the fog. "Are you okay?" No response. "Do you need help?" I asked, my voice cracking on the last word. Still nothing. The figure remained perfectly still, as though it hadn't heard me. Or maybe it had and simply didn't care. My mind raced through every possible explanation, each one more far-fetched than the last. A mannequin, a prank. But deep down, I knew none of those answers fit. The air felt heavier now, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. My stomach churned, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to floor the gas pedal and get as far away as possible. But I was frozen, my hands glued to the wheel, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Then it moved. Not toward me, not away, just shifted, its head tilted to the side, the motion slow and deliberate, as though it were studying me. The gesture was so unnervingly human, yet completely wrong in its execution. My breath hitched, and I felt the sharp sting of my nails digging into my palms. "Say something," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to it or to myself. My voice barely carried in the oppressive silence. The figure didn't respond. I tried to look away, to break whatever strange, invisible hold it had on me, but I couldn't. My gaze was locked on that faceless void, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. It was only when the figure's head tilted again, this time just a fraction too far, the motion sharp and unnatural, that I snapped out of my trance. "I'm sorry," I muttered under my breath, though I didn't know why. My hands fumbled for the gear shift, trembling so badly it took me 2 tries to put the car into drive. As the engine roared to life, the figure remained rooted in place, unmoving, its head still tilted at that unsettling angle. My headlights flared as I eased the car forward, casting distorted shadows that seemed to dance in the fog. I swerved slightly to avoid the figure, my tires skimming dangerously close to the edge of the road. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The figure vanished into the fog as I drove away. The image of it lingered in my mind. My pulse thundered in my ears, my breathing shallow and ragged. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it standing in the road behind me, but all I saw was the endless expanse of swirling mist, thick and unrelenting. "It's fine," I whispered to myself, though the words felt hollow. "You're fine. Just keep going." The road stretched on endlessly, its cracked surface barely visible beneath the fog. The same trees lined the edges, their gnarled branches reaching toward the car like skeletal hands. The world felt smaller, somehow, like the fog was closing in around me, squeezing the life out of everything it touched. Minutes passed, maybe hours. It was impossible to tell. My thoughts swirled as chaotically as the mist outside, flipping between logic and fear. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I'd been driving too long and my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. Then I saw it again. The figure. It was standing in the middle of the road, just as it had before. Same height, same rigid posture, same faceless void staring back at me. My blood ran cold and my foot instinctively hit the brake. "No," I whispered, shaking my head in disbelief. "That's not possible." I didn't turn around. I was certain I'd been driving straight the entire time, but here it was, blocking my path once more. The car idled as I stared at the figure, my mind scrambling for answers. Had I somehow looped back to the same spot? Was the road playing tricks on me? Or worse, was it following me? The figure didn't move. This time, I didn't wait. My heart pounded as I threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as I backed away. But as I looked over my shoulder, I saw nothing but fog. No trees, no road, just a wall of white stretching endlessly in all directions. The figure tilted its head again, and I felt that suffocating pressure return, heavy and inescapable. I slammed the car into drive and sped forward, swerving to avoid the figure. My chest tightened. As I passed it, the fog swallowing it whole. But even as I raced down the road, my hands trembling and my eyes darting to the rearview mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. It was still out there, and it wasn't done with me. The road dipped sharply, and I felt my stomach lurch as the car descended into a valley I hadn't seen before. The fog here was different, denser, with an eerie glow that pulsed faintly, like it was lit from some hidden source deep within. It wasn't natural, not like the low mist you see after a summer rain or an early morning fields. This fog was alive. As I drove deeper, the air grew colder, not the crisp chill of a winter breeze, but a biting, oppressive cold that seemed to seep into my bones. My breaths came in shallow gasps, each one heavier than the last. The heaviness wasn't just physical, it was in the atmosphere itself, pressing down on me like the weight of an unseen hand. The trees that had flanked the road for miles began to thin out, their twisted branches replaced by jagged skeletal rocks. The barren earth was gray and cracked, as if the ground had been drained of life. I slowed the car to a crawl, the tires crunching over loose gravel and brittle soil. My headlights illuminated the landscape, but the light didn't seem to reach far. The glow of the fog swallowed it, reflecting back at me in strange, shifting patterns. I brought the car to a stop, gripping the steering wheel as I stared out at the strange world before me. It didn't feel real. The ground, the rocks, the fog, they all looked like they belonged to another world entirely, one where life didn't exist and time stood still. And then I saw them. At first, they were just shapes, indistinct forms moving through the mist, but as they came closer, their outlines sharpened, and my stomach churned with dread. Everywhere, dozens of them, gliding silently through the glowing fog. Their movements were slow, deliberate, yet unnervingly smooth, as if they weren't walking but floating just above the ground. They didn't look human, not entirely. Their forms were long and gaunt, their limbs stretched unnaturally thin with proportions that made my skin crawl, but it was their faces, or lack of faces, that truly froze me in place. Where eyes, a nose, or a mouth should have been, there was only emptiness, a featureless void that somehow still managed to fix itself on me. The figures turned toward the car, their eyeless faces following my every movement. I tried to convince myself they couldn't see me. They had no eyes. How could they? But the way they angled their heads, the way their presence bore into me, told me otherwise. My hand trembled as I reached for the gear shift, my instincts screaming at me to move, to leave, to do something. But I couldn't look away. The figures were mesmerizing in the most horrifying way, their smooth, empty forms blending seamlessly with the fog, yet standing out enough to keep my attention locked on them. One of them stepped closer, its movements painfully slow but deliberate. My throat as it raised an impossibly long arm, its fingers elongated and spindly, like the roots of a tree. It stopped just short of the car, its hand hovering in the air as though it were testing the space between us. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the eerie silence. I felt trapped, pinned beneath the weight of their collective gaze, if you could even call it that. Every instinct told me to run, but my body refused to obey. More figures emerged from the fog, their movements synchronized like a single entity with dozens of bodies. They surrounded the car now, forming a loose circle, their featureless faces still turned toward me. The pressure in my chest grew unbearable, my lungs struggling to draw in air as if the fog itself was suffocating me. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who or what I was begging. Audible in the oppressive quiet, swallowed almost immediately by the fog. The figure closest to the car tilted its head, the motion unnervingly slow and deliberate. It was a simple gesture, but it felt mocking, almost taunting, as if it understood my fear and reveled in it. I tore my eyes away long enough to glance at the gear shift. My trembling hand moved toward it, gripping it tightly as I prepared to throw the car into reverse. My foot hovered over the gas pedal, my body trembling with adrenaline. But before I could act, The figure's hand moved, pressing lightly against the hood of the car. I jumped, my breath hitching in my throat as the faint sound of its touch echoed in the silence. The pressure wasn't enough to move the car, but it was enough to hold me in place, to remind me that escape wasn't an option. More figures joined it, their hands brushing against the windows and doors, their movements slow and calculated. The sound of their touch was faint, almost like raindrops tapping against glass, but it sent chills racing down my spine. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was sit there, trapped in this strange, suffocating valley, surrounded by creatures that shouldn't exist. And in that moment, I realized the truth. The road hadn't led me here by accident. I wasn't lost. I was exactly where they wanted me to be. My car sputtered, coughed once, and then died completely. The engine's rumble faded into an oppressive silence, so absolute it felt as if even my heartbeat might disturb it. Dimmed, leaving me bathed in a faint glow from the fog that clung to everything. I turned the key. Again, desperate to restart the engine, but all it gave me was a dull click. I was stranded. The figures outside began to shift, gliding closer. Their movements were slow and deliberate, but it was clear they had no intention of stopping. One by one, they emerged fully from the mist, circling the car like predators assessing their prey. There were more of them now, dozens at least, their gaunt forms stretching unnaturally tall in the dim light. Their faces, or the voids, where faces should have been, seemed to absorb the surrounding darkness. I locked the doors, though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, the leather slick beneath my damp palms. My breath fogged up the inside of the windshield, each exhale shallow and panicked. The first figure reached the car, its skeletal hand brushing against the glass with a sound that sent shivers racing down my spine. It wasn't loud, just a faint, deliberate tap, but the sheer wrongness of it made my skin crawl. It tilted its head as though it were studying me, its featureless face drawing closer until it nearly pressed against the glass. You shouldn't have come here. The voice wasn't loud, but it echoed inside my head, reverberating like a whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside, somewhere deep in my mind, burrowing into my thoughts like an unwelcome guest. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the words repeated, softer this time, more insistent. The car began to shake. It started as a faint tremor beneath my feet, but it grew stronger with each passing second. The figures outside pressed their hands against the windows and doors, their long fingers leaving streaks of condensation on the glass. The sound of their touch grew louder, like rain falling in a steady rhythm, but it was uneven, chaotic. My chest tightened as I looked around, desperate for an escape. The key wouldn't turn, the door handles wouldn't budge, and the mist outside was so thick it felt like a wall. I was trapped. The figures didn't break the glass or force the doors open. They didn't need to. The oppressive silence, the suffocating weight of their presence, was enough to make me feel like I was already theirs. I turned toward the back seat, half expecting to see one of them there, but it was empty. Now. And then the whispers started. Dozens of voices filled the car, overlapping in a cacophony of unintelligible words. Some were soft, like a child calling out from another room. Others were harsh, guttural, scraping against my ears like claws on metal. "Why are you here?" one voice asked, almost curious. "Turn back," another commanded, though I didn't know how. "You can't leave," a third whispered, so close it felt like the words were coming from my own lips. The air inside the car grew colder, my breath now visible in short, frantic bursts. Presence closing in, not just around me, but inside me, like they were creeping into every corner of my mind. My thoughts weren't my own anymore. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I unlocked the screen. There was no service, of course, but I opened the camera app out of desperation, aiming it at the windshield. Maybe if I could record this, capture proof, Someone would believe me. The screen flickered. The image wasn't what I expected. It didn't show the figures outside the car or the fog surrounding me. Instead, it showed me, but it wasn't me. The version of me on the screen was sitting in the driver's seat, but her face was twisted into an unnatural grin, her eyes dark and empty. She raised a hand, waving slowly at the camera even, though my own hands were still gripping the phone. I dropped it, the screen shattering on the floor of the car. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse, heavier than before, like the air had been drained from the world. The figures outside didn't move. They just stared, or at least I felt their attention on me. A faint tapping sound broke the stillness. I looked up and my stomach dropped. The figure closest to the windshield leaned forward, its skeletal hand pressing harder against the glass. Cracks began to spiderweb outward from where its fingers touched, but it wasn't breaking the glass. It was reshaping it. The cracks formed words, jagged and uneven, but unmistakable. You are ours. My vision blurred as tears welled up in my eyes. My chest heaved, but the air felt too thick to breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, do something, but my body wouldn't respond. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the sound of the passenger door creaking open. I woke up hours later, or maybe it was days. The car was gone. The fog was gone. I was lying on the side of the road, my clothes damp and my skin ice cold. The valley was nowhere in sight, and the sun was rising, casting long shadows across the empty highway. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady, and looked around. There was no sign of the figures, no sign that any of it had happened, but I knew better. As I walked down the road hoping to find help, I glanced at my reflection in the window of a passing car. My heart stopped. The face staring back at me wasn't mine. If you've ever found yourself driving through an unfamiliar road and the fog begins to close in, don't stop, don't look. And whatever you do, don't try to capture what you see. Because the moment you acknowledge them, they'll know you're there.